G'day Internet, and welcome back to another video. Now, my main era of PC gaming was in my late teens and my early 20s when I started going to LAN parties. Now, this was at the height of Windows 98 gaming, I suppose. To put it into some kind of perspective, one of the first games we started playing was Counter-Strike Beta 0.6, so that kind of puts it a little bit in perspective. So when it came to building a Windows 98 machine for myself, I wanted to kind of go back to what people had back then, with a bit of a twist. There was one guy, a mate of mine, Alan, who had one particular machine that I was always really jealous of. And that's kind of sort of what we're going to build today. Now, I've got an assortment of parts here which are going to go in, but the highlight of this video is this guy right here. This is a Shuttle SS50, which was actually one of the first of these XPC, or small form factor, bare bones machines that Shuttle produced. It's a socket 478, so it takes a Pentium 4. It runs an SIS 650 chipset, but its main calling card is it's small, very small. Now, I know there's a big thing these days of loading XP and 98 on tiny little, like, thin client machines and things like that. But back in the day, this was the small machine that you could get. They weren't cheap, but finally, I have one. So let's take a close look at the components and the shuttle itself. So we've got here a bunch of parts that are fairly typical for its time. We've just got a generic A-Open 36-speed CD-ROM. We've got a 3.5-inch Alps disk drive. We've got a gig of RAM. We've got our 2.4 gigahertz Pentium 4. I decided to go for an SD card hard drive, which is mounted on a 3D printed bracket that I found on Thingiverse. I'll put a link in the description. The only real exception to what would be in the era is the video card. Now, the biggest Achilles heel of this particular shuttle is that it doesn't have an AGP slot. It's only got 2 PCI slots. Now, this particular model was actually replaced by the SS51 less than 12 months after its release. Because of that very thing. But because I'm stuck with a PCI video card, I went hunting around, and the only one I could find that was relatively useful was this FX5500. And I'm kind of hoping that because of the limitation of the PCI bus because it's a bit more powerful than what I was looking for, because I was actually looking for something in the GeForce 4 range, will kind of balance it out a bit. So that's the components. And now we get on to the main attraction, which is the actual Shuttle XPC. And if we just simply remove the thumb screws at the back, we can take a look inside. This simply slides off, in theory, as long as it doesn't get caught on the side. And here we have the insides of the shuttle, and it's very kind of compact inside. It's really well built. On the back we have the onboard SIS video, which we won't be using, which also gave S-video out, a couple of serial ports, Firewire, a couple of USB 1.0 or 1.1 ports, 100 meg Ethernet, PS2 and onboard sound. We've got our little power supply here, which is a 160 watt power supply. I had to get rid of some rust that had appeared on it. And then inside, and the way they were able to do this is we've got a huge heat pipe mechanism. So there's no fan that sits on the actual CPU. And we'll take a closer look at that when we actually install the CPU. And it all goes through to this kind of radiator, I guess you could call it, at the back here. We've got front USB and sound and Firewire, a couple of memory slots. We've got 2 IDE channels, a floppy drive channel, and a couple of, like I said, a couple of PCI slots. So that's the inside of the shuttle. How about we start building it? So here we are. Let's start by putting the CPU in. Now, the heat sink assembly is primarily held in by this clamp that pinches down on top. So that's the little bracket that sits on top. And now, with getting some cables out of the way, this comes straight out. And this is the cooling assembly. We've got a copper plate which feeds into the heat pipes, and that's kind of it. And that's how they managed to keep the size so small. So if we open up the ZIF socket for the processor, now the processor for the Pentium 4s is keyed. There's a little arrow just here, and also the dot which lines up with the socket. Let me just drop that in. And we're in, and we lock it down with the lever for the ZIF socket. And now all we need to do is just simply pop this back in, but I will put some new thermal compounder on there. We can now put our RAM in. One neat little thing this chassis does have is a removable drive bay, which makes life a little easier. It also makes it a little easier for cable routing. So if we remove those couple of screws and slide it back, the bay for the 3.5-inch drive and what would be the hard drive comes out, and we can actually get better access to the entire motherboard. So what I'm going to do is, let's grab the 3.5 and mount it in. And before we tighten those up, I want to, let's back this side off a smidge. I want to put this back in here just quickly. Get the frame where it should be and make sure that the floppy drive is flush with the case, and at least get one of the screws nipped up. Now we can tighten them all down. Right, that's done. Now, what I want to do is I want to get my IDE cables in while I still can. So we've got 1, 2, and 3. We've got a short one for the hard drive because it doesn't have to go far, and a longer one for the CD drive. So if I have a look inside, that's the blue one is IDE channel 1. So let's get that plugged in. And out of the way, and then IDE channel 2 for the CD drive. Helps if I put it in the right way. Okay, so they're in. I'd like to point out that kids these days have no idea how much easier their life is with nice, easy cables like SATA cables and the like, and module power supplies and things like that. So now we can drop that back in and put its screws back into place. Okay, while we're at it, let's put the floppy drive cable in. Now this actually has a locking mechanism on it, which I thought was a little odd, but I guess it's there for a reason. That seems to be all in and happy. Let's now give the floppy drive some power and some data. That feeds around the back nice and neat like that and plugs into the floppy drive like so. So that's all neatly in there now. Next is, what do I want to tackle next? You're going to have to, right, let's get the CD-ROM in, because we're going to have to do some fiddling around with power cables to reach the SD card hard drive. So let's route those around. We have our CD-ROM drive, and it just simply slots in the front. My floppy drive lining up didn't work particularly well. And again, we get this to try and line up as flush with the front as we can. Okay, with that in, we can now get the IDE cable. Actually, there is one other that we need to put in. The analog audio cable. So before I get too far ahead, one end goes into that drive, the other one plugs in down on the motherboard. And now we can plug the IDE cable into the CD-ROM drive. We can give power to the CD-ROM drive. And now we get to tackle what will be the hard drive. So the hard drive's a little tricky because we've got kind of cables running around the place and we're trying to do things like run an IDE cable where it was never designed to run. But if I plug that in there, I'll use the floppy drive power connector because it's less bulky in there, and I should be able to kind of manhandle it into place. It would help if I remove the two screws from the slots. And yes, I have already managed to cut myself because 1990s computer case. And now if we kind of manhandle that into where it needs to be and slot in at the bottom, there's our hard drive, and now we can put, now with this I actually had to remove the top screw from the DVI port because there was no way of actually wedging it in there otherwise, but it does, with a little bit of brute force, get in there. There we go, got it. Okay, now we can put its screw in. And we should be able to put the case back on. Okay, and it's back together. But it could look a little nicer, so just give me a minute. And there we go, it's all put together. Now I'm not going to make you sit through the Windows 98 install because that's not exactly the most exciting thing in the world. Or the day that I lost trying to work out why the graphics card, the NVIDIA graphics card wouldn't play. As a side note, it would seem that unlike Intel and VIA boards of its day, the SIS chipset on this thing doesn't disable the onboard video when you put another video card in it. And it doesn't run side by side either, it just sits there and crashes. So there you go, lesson learnt. There was also the day that I spent trying to remember how to actually get all my games installed, because it's been close to 20 years since I've done it. And then there was the 2 days I spent trying to get a capture out of this thing, which, well, that one actually failed. But the upshot of all of this was it gave me a chance to go back and play with the hardware that I used to and play a lot of the games that I used to as well. Now, I think I've mentioned in the past, but my main time of gaming, especially PC gaming, was in my late teens and early 20s, when I used to go to LAN parties. And that all started off with a mate of mine, Joel, and he said, look, come along this weekend to this LAN party me and a few friends go to and see if you enjoy it. And I thought, you know, why not? Having no idea what a LAN party actually was. So I've rocked up with my rubbish machine of the time. To give you an idea, I think it was a K62500 with an Intel i740 graphics card. So it was terrible even at the time. So I've rocked up and I've plugged everything in, and the guys there were really happy to help me get going, to get the games installed, to get everything kind of running as best it could. And that's mainly down to Steve. So Steve, thanks mate. And so I rocked up and we got Counter-Strike running at a reasonable frame rate. And I thoroughly enjoyed myself. And a mate of mine, Josh, actually managed to dig out some photos from what I think is actually the very first LAN party I went to. That's Joel right there, who invited me along, and I'm not going to tell you who the tall skinny guy is he's talking to. And so this was at a LAN, it was called South Coast LAN, or SCL. And it was set up, it was 2 empty offices, relatively large offices. So we played like Counter-Strike, for instance, a lot. And it was really good because we were able to play like East Room versus West Room, so one room would be CTs and the other one would be Ts. And that was a lot of fun. Another game we played a lot of was Rogue Spear, Rainbow Six Rogue Spear, and later on Raven Shield. And we actually used to play that one co-op. Now, if I remember correctly, Raven Shield had a team limit, a co-op team limit of 8. So it was the first in best strength. So 8 of us would jump in, and we'd play that one cooperative against bots. And actually to this day, that's the kind of game I really enjoy. I like playing first-person shooters, but I really enjoy the co-op ones. So that was always good fun. And of course there was the usual stuff like Quake 3 Arena and things like that as well. Now, SCL kind of, it ran its course for a few years and kind of died off, but I still had friends that we'd go around to their place and we'd plug in a bunch of computers and we'd play some more games. But a few years later, we actually resurrected SCL. We got use of a school hall at the time for the weekend, and we had it all set up, and SCL actually had a kind of an SCL version 2 several years later. So I've got lots of friends that used to play. I'd be interested to hear in the comments if you used to go to LAN parties, either big or small, back in the day, especially in kind of this era. And I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, please click like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.